Al, you're leading this major research project, Big Questions in Free Will. What is the problem about free will that requires such an effort?
Yeah, I can't say that there's just one problem about free will. There are many. Here's one. We find people claiming it's obvious that there's no free will, that is, that free will is an illusion. We find people claiming it's obvious that there is free will. There's no doubt about it. One problem is a semantic one, that people don't use the expression free will in the same way. Another kind of problem about free will really is attached to that problem. It depends on what you think free will means. If you think of free will as a supernatural power, then any evidence against the existence of supernatural powers would count as evidence against the existence of free will. So if you set the bar really high for free will, you're going to have a problem about its existence.
Practically, in terms of the legal system, there are aspects of free will that affects how we deal with crime and punishment.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of presumption, some people deny it, that people need to have free will in order to deserve any sort of punishment or even any sort of credit. But the legal system is less concerned with credit than with punishment. So suppose that's true, that you don't deserve to be punished unless you have free will. Well, where do you set the bar for free will? Is it a supernatural power? If so, and if there aren't any supernatural powers, then nobody has free will, nobody deserves to be punished. Do you set the bar lower? Where? And questions, the bar-setting questions, are among the questions that philosophers and theologians actually deal with.
Indeed, in philosophy, the question of free will is one of the deep probative questions that affects how we think about the history of the universe, the nature of human consciousness. So philosophers take this very seriously.
They do. They do. And among philosophers, there are skeptics about free will. Skepticism actually is sort of a modest term for the view. The view is there is no free will. And there are people who think that there is free will. What you don't know for sure is whether all these groups are using the expression free will in just the same way. So sometimes it might look as though there are disagreements when in fact there aren't. So that if they're using the word to mean two different things, they both might be right. So free will X might not exist and free will Y might exist.
Okay, so tell me about the research project. How is it organized?
The project is divided into three wings. There's a science of free will wing. There's a conceptual underpinnings of free will wing, and that's a philosophy wing, that second one. And then there's a theology of free will wing, and that's for theologians and also philosophers, for example, philosophers of religion.
So in the science wing, who are the scientists, neuroscientists, social scientists? What are the kinds of problems they're working on?
Well, there are neuroscientists, social psychologists, cognitive psychologists. Neuroscientists are working on, roughly, what goes on in the brain when people make decisions. Also the sense or feeling of causing something, of being an agent, as opposed to, something happening to you. The social psychologists are studying things like the effects of people's beliefs about free will on their behavior. They're also studying how layfolk think about free will, and they're studying things like willpower. And the cognitive psychologists just mix into these two groups.
And the second wing in the philosophical underpinnings.
Yes, in the conceptual underpinnings wing, our main questions are traditional philosophical questions, like what are the necessary conditions for free will? Is there good reason to believe that the necessary conditions for free will are satisfied or not satisfied? Questions of that sort. And the theologians are dealing with questions about divine freedom and questions about the connection between the possible existence of God and human freedom. So, for example, an old question is, if God is perfect, then doesn't he always have to do what's best? And if he always has to do what's best, then how can he ever act freely? Or about God's connection to human beings. If God is omniscient, then doesn't he know everything you're ever going to do? And if he knows it in advance, how can you do it freely?
So do you see a cross-pollination between these three wings?
The philosophers and scientists meet together at 3 conferences, and there will be a lot of productive exchange of ideas, I believe.
Okay. And what are some of the specific issues that the scientists and the social psychologists and cognitive scientists are working with philosophers on?
One issue that they're working on is figuring out what lay folk mean by free will. So what you do in these studies is you tell subjects, participants, very short stories, and then ask them questions like, did Johnny do it freely? Does Johnny deserve to be blamed for doing it? That's one. This is called experimental philosophy, but it's done by psychologists too. And that's one thing they're working on together closely, social psychologists and philosophers.
What would you think would be a productive result after millennia of dealing with the problem of free will that can come out of such a focused study?
Well, I can give you one example. I myself think this would be productive. It might not be thought of that way by everybody, but there are quite a few scientists who claim that they have shown or have extremely powerful evidence for the idea that there's no free will. Those scientists tend to think of free will as something that depends upon supernatural properties or non-physical souls.
If it exists at all.
Yes, if it exists at all, it would require those things. And I think one somewhat productive result would come out of the careful survey studies of how layfolk use expressions like free will, blame, and so on. And what we might discover is that it's mainly neuroscientists, some neuroscientists, not all, and maybe 17% of the population who use the expression free will in a way that builds into it supernatural powers or non-physical souls. So that's one sort of small advance we can make. And what can happen then is the same really exciting neuroscientific work could be done, but without drawing this conclusion that to me seems extreme, and that I think depends partly on this semantic point, that these experimenters are understanding free will in a sort of idiosyncratic way.